Tuesday greetings. So raise your hand if you're a regular Tuesday grouper. Well, isn't that heartwarming? If you're not a regular Tuesday grouper, allow me to introduce you to Tuesday Group. Welcome to Tuesday Group. You are here. You are part of it. You are a Tuesday grouper. My name is Lacey Squire. I'm the manager of a program called Boundary Waters Connect, which is an economic and community development program here in Newton. It's a program of Northeastern Minnesota Wilderness. Tuesday Group has a long-standing heritage. It actually began in 2008 with a group of people who were simply interested in convening. It actually had to do with election season, and they had such a good time. They kept getting together over and over and over. They started at Cranberries. Who was familiar with Ely when the Boathouse Brew Pub was Cranberries? Awesome. I am not among you. I never knew Cranberries, but I do love the Boathouse. Eventually, the Tuesday Group gathering got so big and so consistent, they moved to the Grand Evening Lodge. And so this is a 15-year-long tradition that I am very proud to get to carry on with you all. 15 years. The Northeastern Minnesota Wilderness and Boundary Waters Connect was able to take on the mantle of Tuesday Group in 2001. I have been coordinating since that time, so it's a little over 2 years, and we have never had a guest such distinction before. Tuesday Group is all about learning. We are a group of people who convene relatively informally most weeks to learn in community with one another and learn from members of our community. Because the Ely community is so huge. The What's Up Ely Facebook group has 20.3 thousand and counting people in it. So our little town of just over 3,000 people, 3,000 some odd people, has a fan club that large. And that's a network. I mean, I'm really aware sometimes the word networking is a rat and have this like shallow feeling to it. But we know that our network is very real and really supportive and really strong. And it's through the power of the Ely network that we're able to welcome Congressman Jamie Raskin here today. We do have some other dignitaries here in this space with us. And so I'm really glad that Mayor Omerza is here with us today. We have City Council Member Angela Campbell here today. Jen Schultz to be running for Congress. I'm going to take a moment to thank the Minnesota North Vermilion campus representatives who've done so much work in such a short amount of time to make this event possible. Thank you, Dave Marshall and Louise Schmidt, among others. And I would be remiss if I didn't have a moment of gratitude for the Grand Evening Lodge. We typically meet at the Grand Evening Lodge, and we typically have the opportunity to order lunch and the servers and be in community at that lovely space. And we're not there today, but we'll be back there next week. And most of our 46 programs a year take place at the Grand Evening Lodge. So please have lunch sometime there this week, get a little of your lunch today. And thank you again for being here. Okay. So speaking of the power of the Ely network, we are here today and thank you very much to Mr. Jay Cronin. I got a phone call that I missed and then an email from a dedicated, loyal Tuesday Group community member saying, hey, I've got an idea. What do you think about this? Like, would you be willing to do that? It's like. Yes. So I'm going to give the honor of the introduction to Mr. Dave Chronic.
I reluctantly agreed when Lacey asked me to introduce Jamie. It's an honor, of course. And then I was at home on Tuesday group to do it, no big deal. And geez, here I am. I'm just a guy from the woods. I live in the woods. That's what I said. I do have some prepared notes, and that's going to keep me on track from here. So please bear with me. Thank you everybody for coming. This is awesome. Today we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming an individual who's achieved national recognition as a devoted scholar and as a dedicated member of the U.S. House of Representatives. I've come to know Jamie, as well as my wife Peggy, because his daughter and my son were married in the early months of COVID. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah. There was obviously no opportunity for a party or celebration. There hasn't been one since. When they got married, and they got married in typical COVID fashion, therefore, at a courthouse with one witness, two witnesses, not quite sure. And as new parents-in-law, Jamie and Sarah, and Peggy and I were introduced and first met on a Zoom call. That's become the norm these days. Since then, I've learned, as many of you have, about his deep commitment to public service and his eminence as a constitutional scholar. He and I have bonded over our common interest in music when we learned early on that he's big Bruce Springsteen in the East Week Band. I'll keep it short. The power of knowledge and the impact of effective leadership. This is just some reflection on tying this back to our community. Here we have this man of great importance and national stature. Our meetings are locally focused typically, and I think it's important to reflect. The power of knowledge, leadership is something that we all recognize and admire. And Jamie embodies both these virtues in an exceptional manner. So as we gather at Tuesday group, I think it's important to recognize that our small town is not just a dot at the edge of a vast wilderness. It's a place where remarkable people come from and come to. Today, we're in the presence of one such individual. Well,
well, thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you, Lacey Squire and the Tuesday group for this beautiful invitation. Thank you, Jay Chronic, for that wholesome, beautiful Minnesotan introduction. Jay told you all the truth, except he didn't use one important word, which was elopement. In other words, we didn't know anything about it. This has been a point of some controversy in our family, but we're gonna work it out because we've gotten through COVID-19, and so we're gonna figure out a proper celebration over the course of our week in the Boundary Waters here. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Becky Rom, the chair of Save the Boundary Waters. I'm going to wear my new Save the Boundary Waters hat when we go out and do the Boundary Waters. And I also want to say hello to all our distinguished elected officials here and your former state representative, Jennifer Schultz, who's running for Congress now. And so could be my colleague. So Thank you for allowing me to come to this beautiful place on earth. We've only been here for about 24 hours, but it's just so extraordinary, really moving to be here. The weather is perfect and beautiful. I'm coming directly from Capitol Hill, where it's kind of stifling, but I say it's not the heat, it's the stupidity. Well, thank you much. I appreciate that. Well, look, I got close roots in Minnesota. My grandfather was in the Minnesota legislature, where John was also in the legislature. He was a DFLer back in the 1940s and 50s. And but when I was growing up, we used to come to Minnesota every year. This was like our wholesome family vacation, and we would come and always beg to stay longer and longer because you guys have it all going on here. And we would even come up in these parts, some of these lakes. I don't know which of the 10,000 lakes we went to, but we would come up and we would go fishing. I've got some just magnificent memories of it all, and I still have relatives who live not here, but down in the Twin Cities area. So I love Minnesota, and I got to say, I was thinking about Thomas Jefferson, because we spent when I was a professor, we spent a year living abroad, and we were in France, and we had a tour guide who showed us all the places Thomas Jefferson used to go, and he told us that when Jefferson would toast the people of France, he would say, and I want to toast France because everybody on earth who loves freedom has two countries, his or her own, in France. And I was thinking that in America, everybody who loves democracy has two states, his or her own, in Minnesota. So I feel very close to all of you guys here. But America has become a deeply polarized country, at least in terms of our daily political discourse. And I'm convinced that a lot of the polarization and division are really just there for the sake of political polarization and division. If one side says X, the other side has to say anti-X. And the dynamics of political division and polarization on the internet and on the websites and so on deepen this problem, but they may actually be masking a lot of common ground, common sense that still exists within the people of the country. And I should also say that I suspect, with a lot of evidence, I think, but I suspect that there are foreign strategic actors like Vladimir Putin and Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon that have done everything in their power to inject racial, ethnic, religious, ideological poison into the American bloodstream through the internet to try to drive Americans apart. So I think that we have an obligation to try to recover the common ground and the common sense that our country was born with. Common sense was, of course, the great pamphlet that Tom Paine wrote when he came over to America. He arrived 2 years before the revolution in 1774. He fell in love with the promise of America, fell in love with the idea that there could be a nation not governed by kings and queens and royals and lords and nobles, but by the people, just the people in the vast blue sky in Tom Paine's image. That's what America could be. He said that America would become an asylum to humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, okay? An asylum to humanity if we lived up to the values and the ideals of the country. And so he wrote Common Sense, in 1776 as a way to unify the country. And it became the organizing document of our revolution. And by common sense, he meant the sense that everybody has. You didn't need a theology degree or a PhD from a fancy school in England or anything. It was the sense that everybody had, and common sense meant the sense that we have in common if we're willing to reason together, And of course, our founders like Paine and Jefferson and Ben Franklin were champions of the Enlightenment, the idea that we could converse in public based on reason, based on logic, based on facts, based on empirical investigation. And we didn't need superstition and conspiracy theory and mythology. The facts were enough for us to govern and to make progress together. So I was a professor of constitutional law for 25 years before I went to Congress. And so this might be something of a professional hazard, but I do believe that not only does common ground exist in the country, common sense still exists in the country, but the Constitution itself contains the core of principles that we need in order to resolve what seem like the intractable problems of our time. We can use the Constitution and its meaning to recover and to rebuild common ground and common sense in America. So I thought I would take here in northern Minnesota what is usually thought to be the most polarizing, the most divisive, and the most provocative issue in the country, gun violence and gun rights and gun safety, and demonstrate, or at least try to demonstrate, that we're actually not that divided at all, and that a proper understanding of the Constitution will help us transcend the seeming division and polarization that locks us in a paralysis on the problem. Now, most people, I think, regardless of where they think they are on the gun issue, would concur with where the conservative Supreme Court majority ended up in Heller versus District of Columbia in 2008. Now, in this decision, the claim was being made for the very first time that the Second Amendment guarantees the individual the right to own and possess a gun completely detached from service in the militia. And if we can start the PowerPoint and go to the Second Amendment, just the language of the Second Amendment. Oh, I got to do this myself. So this one. Okay, cool. If you would do the first click for me. Thank you, Lacey. Actually, you could go to the Second Amendment if you would. We'll go back to the first. We'll still okay. Okay, so this is the text of the Second Amendment: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the survival of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, up until the Heller decision in 2008, the court had always taken the position, and the academic scholarship was on the side of the idea that the meaning of the Second Amendment was that people only possess the right to a gun if they're in the militia, which today we would call the National Guard. In other words, if you're ready to be mobilized. Okay, so that was the traditional position, which was challenged over a period of decades. And in 2008, in this challenge to the District of Columbia's handgun control law, the Supreme Court overturned that position in a controversial decision, 5-4, and said, no, the Second Amendment actually does give all individuals the right to gun ownership for two purposes. And one is a handgun for the purposes of self-defense. And two is for the possession of a rifle for hunting and recreation. Now, the liberals on the court disagreed with that and wanted to adhere to the older understanding that the meaning of the Second Amendment is defined by its so-called prefatory clause of a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state. Okay, they said that it was tethered to malicious service, and the court rejected that. And there's still some people who believe that, but I would say that where the court ended up was actually where most Americans are, whether as a matter of constitutional law or as a matter of public policy, that people have a right to a handgun for self-defense, and people have a right to rifle for whatever hunting and recreational purposes they want to have. Now, if you go to the next slide, Justice Scalia, who wrote the opinion, was also extremely clear that the Second Amendment right, like every other right contained in the Bill of Rights, is conditioned upon reasonable regulation in service of common interests, public safety, and public security. So he said, let's see, you go to the next one if you would. Let's see, maybe that one got omitted, but in any event, what he said was that, but of course, this right, like all other rights contained in the Bill of Rights, is conditioned upon public safety and public security and the regulations that are adopted there. And specifically, he said, background checks were okay, restrictions on carrying guns into sensitive public places, city halls, public schools, and so on. But he made it clear that although the right exists, it's always got to be existing in the context of the neighborhood of public interest principles. And of course, in the context of the First Amendment, we understand the same thing. You have a First Amendment right to speak, but you don't have a First Amendment right to get your bullhorn or your megaphone in front of the White House at 2 o'clock in the morning when people are sleeping inside. The Supreme Court has always said that the basic rights we have are subject to reasonable time, place, manner restrictions in order to enhance public security and public safety. So I'm willing to venture the thesis that even the people who belong to the gun safety organizations accept this basic understanding that people in America, and again, still makes us somewhat of an outlier, but people in America are entitled to defend themselves with a handgun and also to have a rifle. Now, also, regardless of your politics or where you think you position yourself in the great, gun safety debate, I think that the vast majority of Americans, if not all Americans, agree that the current situation is absolutely intolerable in terms of the bloodshed and the gun violence that we see on a daily basis in America. We have rates of gun homicide and gun violence that are 25 times higher than other comparable nations in the world, like Canada, Germany, UK, all the European nations, Israel, Japan, you name it. Nothing comes close to America in terms of the levels of gun violence and gun homicide that we experience. We lose more than 100 people every single day to gun violence. Most in one-on-one gun violence situations, but increasing numbers and increasingly large share in massacres, in mass shootings, which the experts define as 4 people or more being shot. So we now have on average more than 1 mass shooting every single day. Last year was close to 2 mass shootings every day. Most of them you never hear of, but they're part of that same chain of massacre and catastrophe that includes Columbine in Colorado, Sandy Hook Elementary School, in Connecticut, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School massacre, in Florida, the Pulse nightclub shootings in Orlando, the Virginia Tech massacre, which took the lives of dozens of college students, Sutherland Springs, Aurora, Colorado, the Uvalde, Texas elementary school massacre, the Mother Emanuel Church massacre of praying parishioners in Charleston, South Carolina, the Walmart massacre of dozens of people in El Paso, Texas, the Buffalo supermarket killings by a white supremacist the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, more parishioners killed there at a synagogue, the Las Vegas mass shooting, which took the lives of 60 people, and so on and on. I mean, we could spend hours just reading the names of the massacres and days more reading the names of the victims. Now, there's in fact pervasive agreement in the country about what needs to be done about this bloodbath that we're in. More than 90% of Americans, the vast majority of Democrats, the vast majority of Republicans, the vast majority of independents agree that there must be a universal violent criminal background check on all gun sales in America. Everybody pretty much agrees with that. 87% of Americans who do not belong to the NRA agree with that. 70% of American gun owners who do belong to the NRA agree with that there needs to be a background check to make sure that violent felons, that fugitives from the law, undocumented people, and others who should not be getting guns don't get them. And yet we have these loopholes in the law that people can purchase guns without going through a background check at private gun shows, in one-to-one private gun sales, and on the internet. And if we close those loopholes, we would save a lot of people's lives. That's how a lot of those guns are getting into the hands of criminals and into the criminal underground. Similarly, we have vast support. 75% of gun owners, 80% of non-gun owners supporting the red flag laws, the extreme risk protection orders, where families or police officers who believe that someone is presenting a danger to himself or herself or to other people can go to court and to get a civil protection order in order to prevent gun violence or massacre. And again, the majority of Americans favor a ban, restoring the ban that we used to have on the sale of AR-15s, which is the choice assault weapon in massacres, and other weapons of mass destruction, other military-style assault weapons. And of course, the AR-15 and assault weapons are not used by hunters in hunting, and they're not used for self-defense. So they do not fall within what the Supreme Court said were the core purposes of allowing individuals to have guns detached from actual militia service. Okay, so what I'm willing to venture is that even the people who see themselves as the most concerned about gun violence and the most liberal in terms of wanting to regulate it in the interests of public safety, accept that people have a right to rifles and to hunt and to engage in lawful recreation, and also to defend themselves with a handgun in the home, which is what the court said in the Heller decision. And also that the vast majority of people consider themselves very strong pro-gun rights people, also recognize that the current situation of mass bloodshed and random gun violence is intolerable and unacceptable, and something needs to be done, and we can do these things without actually impairing what the underlying constitutional right is that people have. All right, now, the problem is that the National Rifle Association and some of the politicians who follow it closely say that the actual meaning of the First Amendment, of the Second Amendment rather, the actual meaning of the Second Amendment is to empower the people to overthrow the government. Okay, this is NRA dogma. The actual purpose of the Second Amendment, they say, is to give the people the power to overthrow the government if it turns tyrannical. So here's one of my colleagues, Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida, who says the Second Amendment, quote, is about maintaining within the citizenry the ability to maintain an armed rebellion against the government if this becomes necessary. Here's my colleague Lauren Boebert from Colorado. The Second Amendment is our protection against a tyrannical government. Quote, it has nothing to do with hunting unless you're talking about hunting tyrants. Maybe. Here's my colleague Chip Roy, my friend and my colleague Chip Roy from Texas, who says, the Second Amendment is designed purposefully to empower the people to be able to resist the force of tyranny used against them, which means, of course, you can't regulate the AR-15s and assault weapons, or indeed tanks, or what have you, because the people have to have an arsenal equal to that possessed by the government. Now, it so happens that there are more than 400 million firearms in America today. Certainly the people have a lot more firearms than the Army has, or the Navy, the other armed forces. But the claim is essentially that the people who are, in fact, the militia must have an arsenal equal to the firepower of the US government in order to be able to overthrow the government if the government becomes tyrannical. All right, and this is the central claim of the people who oppose effectively in Congress every effort we make to pass a universal violent criminal background check supported by more than 90% of the people, or the other measures that are supported by the vast majority of the American people, the red flag laws, the ban on military-style assault weapons as objects for sale in civilian commerce, and so on. Now, so this is the claim that I want to look at today, and I want everybody to think about, because this is a clear constitutional claim that's being made about what the Second Amendment will allow or not allow. And I want us to take it seriously. I try to take it very seriously and debate with my colleagues about it all the time, because if they're right, then of course there's nothing that we could do short of amending the Constitution. And in fact, they will often get up and they say, Raskin wants you to repeal the Second Amendment. And I say, no, I don't want you to repeal the Second Amendment. I want you to read the Second Amendment, okay? We don't need to repeal the Second Amendment. But if they're wrong that about their claim that the Second Amendment gives you the right to take up arms against the government, well then, in that case, we can proceed to enact reasonable gun safety reforms that are supported by the vast majority of the American people. So let's look at the claim, okay? Before we do a doctrinal analysis of it, let me just start with this, because insurrection, as you know, has been in the news recently, and we've had more than 1,000 prosecutions and indictments of people for engaging in insurrection. We've had dozens of people convicted of seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government. People who pled guilty to seditious conspiracy. And do you know how many of the indictments have been quashed, or prosecutions have been nullified, or convictions have been overturned because there's a constitutional right located in the Second Amendment to overthrow the government? None of them, zero, have been quashed on that basis. So that should at least get you thinking, have the courts missed something? Have all these defense lawyers actually missed something about the insurrectionary thesis of our Constitution, that the Second Amendment gives us the right to overthrow the government? Another kind of prefatory point we could make is it's kind of what the Civil War was about, wasn't it? I mean, do you have the right to overthrow the government? And Lincoln said, no. He said, in fact, insurrection is an attack on what Lincoln said was the first principle of democratic government, which is the right of the people to choose their own leaders. So if we've chosen our own leaders, and then someone says, we don't like your leaders, we don't like your process, we don't like your election, we're going to depose the whole system with a violent insurrection, that's not an exercise of constitutional rights. That's an attack on the constitutional order and the right of the people to govern ourselves and to choose our own leaders. But let's look at it. I'm not even going to ask anybody to read any Supreme Court decisions. I'm going to ask you only to engage in the strenuous act of reading the Constitution itself. Okay, and so I've assembled, I hope this is good. Let's go to the next one. Okay, so let's start there. Okay, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. And this is Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates the powers of Congress. Well, one of the powers of Congress is to call forth the militias from the states in order to repel foreign invasions and to suppress insurrections. Now that's interesting, isn't it? On the one hand, the claim is being made that the Second Amendment, which doesn't mention insurrections and doesn't mention rebellions and doesn't mention revolutionary violence against the government, gives you the right to engage in insurrection. But here, in actual written language, Congress has the power to summon the militias that are sometimes characterized as potential sources of revolutionary popular violence against the government to put down insurrections. And where does that come from? Well, you guys remember Shays' Rebellion in the 1780s? You remember this? Some people actually remember it, it sounds like. So Shays' Rebellion triggered a federal response and a state response to put down the rebellion, and the founders were absolutely adamant that nobody has the right to engage in extra legal, extra constitutional means to overthrow the government. Okay, let's go to the next one. Here's the Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4, Section 4. U.S. shall guarantee to every state and union a Republican form of government and shall protect them against invasion and against domestic violence. Okay, so Congress has a responsibility to protect a Republican form of government. And that, by the way, that doesn't mean a Republican Party form of government. It means a representative form of government, and to protect the states against foreign attack and against domestic violence from within. Now, is it possible that the Second Amendment in invisible ink gives you the right to engage in domestic violence against your government, against the police, against the leaders, but at the same time, the Constitution gives people the guarantee that Congress will intervene to stop a violent attack on their governments? That seems very unlikely to me. Let's go to the next one. Here we go. Here's the treason clause of the Constitution. Well, treason consists in levying war against the Union, against the government, or adhering to their enemies. So is it possible you've got a right to wage war on your government, but it's also treason? And remember, they're trying to torture out of the Second Amendment the idea that you've got a right to attack the government, but the treason clause says is the only place in the entire Constitution where a crime is defined. It's the most significant extreme crime, the crime of attacking the government, right? I found 5 other places in the Constitution. Go to the next one. I can't remember what I put up there next. But this is my favorite one. Okay, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says, you've been elected to office. You've sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic. But if you've engaged in insurrection or rebellion, You may never hold federal or state office again in the United States. Okay. Now, is it possible that the Second Amendment, again, which doesn't mention insurrection or rebellion in any explicit terms at all, gives you a right to overthrow your own government, and yet it's a crime considered so treasonable and so extreme that if you engage in it as a president or a representative or a senator or so on, you can never hold office again? That seems fantastical to me. That just seems impossible that that's the meaning of our Constitution. So I could keep going, but I think you get the idea that our Constitution is an anti-insurrectionary Constitution. And when I pointed out to my colleagues across the aisle, and I just read them chapter and verse what the Constitution says, some of them will leave the room, but when I get a substantive response, it comes in two varieties. One is, well, what about Patrick Henry? Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death, which, yes, was a great 18th century bumper sticker, I suppose, by a Virginian anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. Okay, so he opposed the Constitution precisely because he thought it centralized power too much in the government. And so he didn't want to have anything to do with it. He voted against it. It would be like if we were trying to interpret the meaning of the 13th Amendment or the 14th Amendment, and we asked what Jefferson Davis thought about it, right? If we asked for a Confederate interpretation of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, that just doesn't make any sense. So then their argument, and this one has a lot more surface plausibility, is, well, what about the American Revolution itself? What about the Declaration of Independence? We rebelled against royal tyranny. We engaged in a revolution against those who would violate our rights. And that is 100% true and accurate. But if you read the Declaration of Independence, which I urge you to do, Thomas Jefferson never once appealed to the Magna Carta or the British Constitution or British law. He appealed to natural law and natural right. He said that we appealed with a decent respect to the opinions of mankind, that we are being tyrannized by a long train of abuses and usurpations by the British Crown. And that's why he said we will pledge to each other our fortunes and our sacred destinies together, because he understood that we were stepping outside of the realm of British constitutional law. And he knew that the people doing that were putting their lives at risk. And he said that they were willing to do it by appealing to natural law and natural right. So, but Abraham Lincoln was very clear, because he went right back to that point during the Civil War. And Lincoln said, you either have a right to change the governmental structure through the constitutional means, including by amending the Constitution, going through Article 4, getting a 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate, getting 3/4 of the state to agree, or by changing law through the state legislatures or federal law, or he said, you have a right to step outside the whole constitutional structure and take your chances with an attack on the whole constitutional regime. But he said it would be absurd if the Constitution gave people the right to destroy the Constitution. And no, we do not have the only Constitution on earth which gives the people the power to destroy the Constitution. If you think, for example, that the 2020 presidential election, instead of being the safest and most secure election in presidential history, according to President Trump's own Department of Homeland Security, if you think that, in fact, over the evidence of 60 federal and state courts rejecting every claim of electoral fraud and corruption, if you still think that that election is an exercise in tyranny, well, then by all means, you have a right to come, a natural right to come and attack our police officers and bloody them and put them in the hospital and storm the Capitol and try to overthrow an election which Joe Biden won by 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College. But if you fail in that enterprise of revolutionary violence, we will arrest you, we will prosecute you under our laws with the presumption of innocence and due process. And if you're convicted, like Stuart Rhodes, the Yale Law School graduate who is head of the Oath Keepers, you will go to jail for many years in the United States of America. All of which is to say that we're living in a time of insurrectionary thinking and insurrectionary politics. It's not the first time in American history. I don't want people to get too freaked out about it. They're not the first people who thought they could overthrow the government of the United States. They're not the first people who thought that they would appoint themselves a dictator and in charge over the will of the people. That's not the first time that that's happened. But when we talk about gun violence, this insurrectionary theory of the Second Amendment is contributing to a lot of unnecessary death and bloodshed. It is wrong. Under the Second Amendment, we can pass a universal violent criminal background check. We can pass the red flag law, and we can ban military-style assault weapons, and we can protect everybody's right to have a handgun for self-defense if they feel they need it, and to carry a rifle for purposes of hunting and recreation. We can get through this. We can make this happen in America. We can recover the common sense that our forebears bequeathed to us. We can recover the common ground that is our birthright as Americans. So thank you for giving me the chance to share some thoughts with you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you got.
I'm very glad you brought up the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I'm sure it did not escape your notice that 4 days ago, Professors William Bogg from the University of Chicago and Michael Stokes Paulson from the University of St. Thomas published in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review an article that has gotten national prominence, saying that in their considered opinion, which they took a year to formulate, and mind you, these two professors are members of the Federalist Society, so they are conservatives. Not exactly on your side of the politics. And they noted in their opinion that Donald Trump was not eligible to run for election as president of the United States because Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that anyone engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof states is banned from office. What is your opinion?
Well, I thought I made myself pretty clear on that. But first, let me just say something about the conservative thing. And it's true that these are self-identified conservatives and active in the Federalist Society, and they're saying, you know, a strict constructionist literal reading of the Constitution leads to the inescapable conclusion that if you've engaged in insurrection and rebellion, and of course, Donald Trump was already impeached for inciting insurrection, and he was voted guilty by 57 to 43 margin in the Senate. He beat the constitutional spread in the inimitable Trump fashion, and we didn't make it to 2/3 for a conviction, but you still have current commanding bipartisan, bicameral majorities defining as a legislative fact that he engaged in incitement to insurrection. But I wanted to say just about that conservative thing for a moment, because I've been trying to rethink all of the labels. And, one of my colleagues said to me, Raskin, you're not a bad guy. The problem with you is you're a liberal. And I said, you're damn right I'm a liberal. The part of the word liberal is liberty. And if we're not for liberty, what are we for? And I'm a progressive because I'm for progress in government. But my favorite thing to call myself today is a conservative, because I want to conserve the land, the air, the water, the boundary waters, the Bill of Rights, Social Security, Medicare, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the National Labor Relations Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, everything that they want to destroy is everything I want to conserve. So I feel like a conservative today, but look, the reason that I'm talking about this insurrectionary challenge to the Constitution is precisely because this is so important. America is a country that is not defined by one race or one ethnicity or one religion or one political party or one political ideology. We're defined by one Constitution. And either we agree to abide by it and stick to the rules, or we go to hell. And we've got to stick to the Constitution as it's written. And if you betray the Constitution, if you engage in insurrection or rebellion, you have disqualified yourself under the terms of the Constitution itself.
Now, I know you don't represent Minnesota, you represent Maryland, but it seems like you have some experience in Minnesota as far as fishing and enjoying our natural resources. So I was going to ask you, what was your stance on mining in Ely, and how would you go about, getting the materials and resources we need for the clean energy transition? That's not, outsourcing everything to third world countries.
Cool. Parker, thank you. I am here on a fact-finding expedition. I need to educate myself a lot more, and I've been invited to go on a tour of the Boundary Waters, and I plan to do that, and I'm going to collect all the information I can about it. So I don't think I should pronounce upon the whole mining thing until I get through with that. But my predilection is to try to preserve as much of the boundary waters and as much of the environment as we can. And so I don't know what the specific issue or legislative proposal is that you're referring to, but I promise to check it out. Yeah. Well, that question was, will Trump go to jail? And I think that, look, but one of the problems we've gotten into that I think that Donald Trump has helped us get into is politicians, presidents, members of Congress trying to micromanage legal prosecutions, investigations, and judicial processes. And I think, the proper thing for us to do is to say that we should let the legal process work itself out. That's all we wanted. And I say that with respect to Hunter Biden. I say that with respect to Donald Trump or anybody. I think it's important that the law be enforced equally towards everyone, fairly towards everyone, so the presumption of innocence and due process are respected. I am a liberal, so I don't celebrate people being in prison. On the other hand, I understand there are people who belong in prison because they've set themselves at war against our society in different ways. But I was an assistant attorney general, state assistant attorney general for a while on the public prosecutor side, and I decided that kind of was not where I wanted to go. I wanted to try to deal with problems in advance rather than just put people in jail for the things that they do wrong. And let's just hope that we can learn from this whole episode to fortify American democratic institutions, protect the right to vote, and protect the right of the people to decide who we're going to have as our leaders, and not allow our elections to be stolen away.
I represent the Range Association of Municipalities and Schools. We've got every school district, every major city, and most of the townships on the Iron Range, from Silver Bay to Ely, all the way to Grand Rapids. But one thing I'm interested in is really great that you're raising the level of conversation. There's a lot of vitriol, there's a lot of hatred, there's a lot of rancor and anger, and in every conversation it seems there's a nature of conversation. And you brought up the sensitive issue about copper mining near the boundary waters, and mining in general is a sticky situation. It affects lots of communities, and both up and down, we see lots of different people have lots of different opinions. I'm really heartened to hear that you're interested in fact finding and learning more about situations. What plans do you have to go on other fact finding missions in other areas of Minnesota, and we at the Range Association help bring you to other places?
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. But I'm actually on a tour. I mean, I'm going through Minnesota. We're going to spend a week here. We're going to Colorado, the Michigan. I'm going to New York. I'm headed out to some other states. So, but my mind is very much open. Thank you for what you're doing. Wait, you represent the schools,
We have an association, all school districts, major cities on the range, and townships, and we
Oh, that's
try to
great.
bring conversations together on thorny issues that are impact the whole range.
Well, good for you for giving voice to people's concerns and their differences, their conflicts, but trying to work it out. Well, one of the books that I wrote is called We the Students, about the rights of students in public schools. It got censored by the state of Texas. So I appreciate the fact that I haven't been censored here in Minnesota. And actually, on the same day that I got censored by Texas, it may have been a few days later, Vladimir Putin banned me for life from going to Russia for my training activities. So I've been banned in Texas and I've been banned in Russia, but I'm making it here in Ely, Minnesota.
To reach out and visit a lot of different parts of the state and continue the conversation, because it doesn't just stop.
I appreciate that very much. I really do.
Jury, all the criminal cases. I'm afraid that's right. You can't lose track of all the indictments that are happening and the people all the people. And so he's able to generate this attack on the person. Bring attention to the importance of enforcing the law.
So that's a great question, Mr. Dayton. I certainly know that name from Minnesota history. But you don't know which Daytons I'm aware of. No, I mean, it's a great point. I think that one of the problems we got in the country is economic inequality, and the framers were really concerned about this. They knew if some people got so wealthy and so rich that they would consider themselves beyond the law, and it wouldn't be enough for them to purchase more houses and more, I guess not cars, but carriages or whatever. They would start purchasing public offices, and then they would consider themselves even more immune to the law. But that's why we have a jury system and we have a judicial system. I mean, Donald Trump might think that the jury is the people who watch him on certain news channels, but that's not the jury. The jury in Georgia is like the grand jury in Georgia, which just returned this indictment with dozens of criminal charges against him for running a racketeering enterprise and trying to overthrow the electoral process of Georgia. So, if I were him, I would take that seriously. Like I would take seriously the charges that he deliberately pilfered, top security classified government documents and then repeatedly refused to return them. I mean, these are serious charges. He's got nearly 100 criminal charges against him in all of these different courtrooms. Now, it's true that you can run for office if you're a born U.S. citizen and you're 35 years old, but there's also that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. You can't have engaged in insurrection or rebellion. So there are a lot of ways that can come back to haunt him. And, when I was leading the House impeachment managers over to the Senate for the trial, I said to the Republican senators, you've sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, you've sworn an oath as a juror in this case to render impartial justice, which means nonpartisan justice. But if none of that really matters to you, think about what he will do to your party, because he will destroy your party. He will destroy Lincoln's party. And I think that we're in the process of seeing that happen. Lincoln created a pro-freedom, anti-slavery, anti-know-nothing, pro-immigrant party of freedom. And Donald Trump has turned it into an authoritarian cult of personality. And now what the majority of the people have already made up their mind that they're not interested in us going down the road to authoritarianism. And it's just really a question for the Republican Party. There are some Republican leaders who are beginning to speak out, like Chris Christie and some others, who are saying, hey, you know, these indictments are very serious business. You've got juries of citizens who are juries of his peers in different states across the union who are voting that to find that beyond a reasonable doubt he has likely committed these crimes. And the one in Georgia is a conspiracy that involves him and 18 co-conspirators. And that one's a very detailed, fact-based conspiracy that was handed down yesterday. So citizens have to do our job as citizens. That's why I'm out here talking to everybody about what we're going through. The jurors have to do their jobs, both in the grand juries and in the petit juries that are going to end up deciding. And then we do have to stand by the justice system, as you are suggesting, whether he's acquitted, whether he's convicted, or whatever. You know, that's what our system is, and we gotta stand by that. But I think from the standpoint of the Constitution, it's clear he's already been impeached for inciting an insurrection against the Union, and more facts are coming out all the time.
This is actually a statement. Jennifer's floor and she thing for listens to everything and asks questions. And so she knows about songs. And sometimes they put things in like Disney movie comparison.
You got to make it age appropriate. Yeah. Yeah.
Wanted to tell you that we needed a girl president.
Well, then I nominate Juniper. What do you say, Juniper? Would you be our first girl president? Yeah. Well, you know, we've got a girl vice president. We had a great woman who was Speaker of the House of Representatives named Nancy Pelosi. You ever hear of her? And yeah. Anything that boys can do, girls can do, and a lot of things that boys do that girls would never do. So, nice to see you guys.
I didn't know what it was.
And neither did I.
Conversation about gun safety and regulations and appropriateness as it relates to Donald Trump is intersecting a lot of thoughts in my head about our district and where we live. We have a strong gun culture here in the Northland. And when I entered the state Senate, there were a lot of people that didn't know where I would stand on a lot of issues. And we heard the universal background check bill. We also had the ERCO, the red flag law bill that we heard. And I just want to be honest, because a lot of my constituents are in the crowd, they may not know the background of how it all played out.
But I, at one point, went to the chair of the Judiciary Committee and told him that I could get there on background checks, but I couldn't do the red flag one. And I had a really hard time sleeping that night. I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. And thinking about the school shootings that we had in our country, thinking about their safety, but also thinking about the hunting that I did with my grandfather and this tradition of gun ownership that I had, it was really hard for me to figure out what I needed to do. And I bring this up because we are in the epicenter of these conversations, these political difficult decisions that our leaders need to make. And ultimately, I got on the red flag law and the background check bill. Minnesota will now have those bills. And I say that because it's going to be a test for the region. It's going to be a test for the Northland to determine, are we going to keep electing leaders that take those difficult decisions and do the things that are right? Or are we going to let Trump and the far right take our state in a different direction? And so I just want to say I really appreciate your thoughtfulness on this issue, and I hope that our region can stick together and keep pushing for common sense things like HERPO and background checks. So it's just awesome presentation.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for. Well, thank you for that wonderful statement. Thank you for your great public service. And I mean, you're exactly the kind of political leader who can steer us through all of this, because there's been so much hyperbole and propaganda and such an effort to drive people apart on it. There's an interesting book I'll recommend to everybody called Gunfight by a professor at UCLA named Alan Winkler. But one of the things he does is he studies the history of the National Rifle Association. You know, for most of its history, certainly from my childhood, the NRA was the reasonable, common sense, kind of moderate gun organization that championed all of the gun safety rules and regulations and, you know, things like what you were describing. And at a certain point, it got taken over for partisan purposes. I think Newt Gingrich was involved in it. And they said, hey, you know, we could drive a wedge in the country over this. We could, instead of it being a bipartisan organization that people from, you know, different political perspectives. And remember, John Dingell from Michigan, a big Democrat, was one of the leading forces in the NRA. But instead, we can drive it apart by opposing every kind of gun safety regulation in the country. And that's where we've gotten a situation where they're saying, the Second Amendment gives you the right to go to the government, so therefore we cannot have any regulation of any guns at all, and everything will lead to confiscation, which is absurd, because I think the vast majority of American people accept that kind of Heller position, that Heller compromise, and where the court, you know, put it in the Heller decision. So I appreciate what you're doing. I believe that this part of Minnesota can help lead the country in terms of arriving at just the kind of equilibrium you're talking about, and we can reduce the gun violence and bloodshed without, you know, destroying the hunting culture, the recreational culture that exists in so many parts of America, especially in the rural areas. So thank you. Thanks for coming too. I would have recognized you.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Well, hey, it's my family duty. Do they want to, you want to use the microphone? Get over there.
It's old ladies' day. I have been a fan of yours for years. We have a lot in common that you don't know. I'll tell you what. We had a son that had diffuse lymphoma. He passed away 39 years ago at the age of 19. So that's a connection. And I'm sorry if I'm bringing up upset. When your son died, that was my other son's birthday. So I believe we've got, I think that's the reason why I've always liked you. You know, and you tell the truth. And what I wanted to ask you is, when Trump got elected, I I was so upset. My granddaughter cried for 3 days, and she's an attorney in New York. And I didn't think he could do this much damage to our country in 4 years. And I was wondering, did you think when he got elected that he would tear this nation apart the way he has?
Laura, thank you. You didn't tell me your name, Laura. That's a certain kind of progress there. Well, nice to meet you, Laura. Thank you for your beautiful words, and I'm sorry about the loss of your son. Yeah, well, yeah, it's been a heartbreak in our family. I didn't introduce my wife, Sarah. Sarah's here. They had everybody here. And our older daughter Hannah is here, and Hank, my son-in-law. So, they are the elopements. That's good for me. I'm not sure it's good for her. Yeah. Well, thank you for all of your sweet and kind words, and I love to see the painting. Oh, beautiful. Well, thank you for coming. You didn't. You didn't. Oh, did I ever think? Oh, geez. It's a beautiful question. I wrote a book. My book, Unthinkable, is, yeah, I mean, it's my best effort to try to capture the dreadful period that we went through with the loss of Tommy on the last day of 2020 and COVID-19, which, was such a horror for our young people, the isolation, the devastation, the setbacks they experienced in their careers, in their education, in their relationships. And then trying to figure out how that happened. I mean, we came very close to being a failed state. The political scientists define a failed state as a state that can't deliver the basic goods of existence to its people. And when it came to public health, that's where we were. I mean, we lost more than 1 million Americans during that period. Such a horror. And so in my life, the loss of Tommy is the central thing. The COVID-19 infused all of it, and then the insurrection on January 6th and the violence and the attempt to overthrow our democracy. And so, I said in that week, people were asking why I went down to participate in the county electoral college on January 6th. And our younger daughter Tabitha came, and Hank came with me, and they were there that day. And people asked why I went, and we had lost Tommy just the week before, and we had his funeral service the day before. It was a COVID service, so could only be family members there. But I mean, first of all, it was a constitutional duty to go, but also there were these challenges going on, and Speaker Pelosi asked me to respond to the challenges to Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. So I was ready to try and do that. And our margins were very small, and members were dropping like flies because of COVID-19. Also, people were getting sick, and we live closer to the Capitol than any other member of Congress. I just felt, I felt like I had to go down there, but I said I was not going to lose our son in 2020 and lose our country in 2021, and I feel the same way.
where there will be a book signing situation briefly. Mr. Principal.
Thank you for being here. Envelope. What was that, right? I'll do one thing. Yeah, man, that's tough when we gotta take another hour to talk about that. So I'm the ranking Democrat on the House Oversight Committee now. You may notice them. Like tete-a-tete sometimes with Chairman Comer on different things and trying to uphold our democratic institutions and the Constitution and so on. And so the Senate seat was tempting just because it's like a new situation, and I love our state, of course, Maryland, and I love the idea of going around the whole state and talking and meeting everybody. But ultimately, I just felt that I'm in a position now in the House where I can get so much done. If we win the House back, which I fully intend us to do in 2024, I'll be the chair of the Oversight Committee, and I'll be able to, get a lot of things done. And so that's what I've decided till now. That's where I am, and I've only run for two things in my life: the state Senate and U.S. House. Both times I knew exactly, and so this has been weird. Of course, I had just come through 6 months of chemotherapy because of my lymphoma situation, and the day after I, rang the bell, and then my last chemo session, our senator, Ben Cardin, announced he wasn't going to run. So I didn't have a lot of time really to think about it. And I'm still recovering. It takes a while after chemo to get your complete energy back. But my neuropathy's gone, my nose is gone, and my eyebrows came back, my hair is coming back. So, yeah, that's a beautiful question. So I get to mentor your mentors here. So, we look to small town America for the solution. When I was growing up, my dad used to say, "When everything was hopeless, you're the hope." And I'm looking at the hope right here because it's much more intimate in a community, and it's true that can lead to hard feelings, but it can also lead to real conversations. And I just feel like, if we're not going to have a civil war, and I really hope we don't, despite the fact that some people are talking about it, then we're talking about our fellow countrymen and women, and we have a responsibility, to follow Lincoln and find those underlying mystic chords of affection that bind us together as Americans. And so, I quoted Lauren Boebert because I think her position is so wrong on the Second Amendment. But, Lauren told me that her son had a baby. She's a grandmother. I'm jealous. So we gave Lauren a baby gift for her grandchild. I found her a T-shirt that said that I may take a lot of naps, but I'm still woke. And then we gave her a baby round too, because I wasn't sure if they'd actually use it. But anyway, come on, we're Americans and we can talk about these things, right? Are Americans really afraid of other Americans? How fearful and cowardly have we become as a people who are afraid to talk to other Americans about things? We're afraid to talk about our own Constitution. We're afraid to talk about our own history. Come on. So, I agree that it's become tougher with the internet because everybody's in their own little informational ghetto and, just propounds their own thing and doesn't get out and, speak in real life reality to other people. So we need to make that happen. That's why I'm glad to be here at University of Minnesota North, in the great community college system. And where you guys meeting was? The Grand Ely Live. Well, next time I'm coming back to the Grand Ely Live. So, but yeah, I mean, like, that's where we're going to be able to get through this thing. And I agree that there are some people on all sides walking around like members of religious cults, where they just repeat what their cult leader says. I mean, what a betrayal that is of what it means to be an American. You're going to let some president, presidents work for us. You let some president, some former president dictate what you're going to think? I mean, come on, that doesn't feel very American to me. We question everybody. We don't just follow orders because somebody takes over a political party, right? And I've told some of my colleagues when they voted against impeachment, I said, when this is over, some of you guys are going to be fit only for sleeping on the floor and listening to tapes all night and selling incense at Dulles Airport. I mean, they're members of a religious cult. Like, that's not what it means to be an American. Like, use your mind, use your critical thinking skills. So I guess that's what I would say. But you need to have that element of affection and connection to people. We are, what one can say, we are not enemies. We are friends. We must not be enemies. I like what Obama said at the 2008 convention. We're not the red states of America or the blue states of America. We're the United States of America. Everywhere. Why are we afraid to disagree about things and have a conversation? We can disagree. We can show each other. We can disagree, right? Some reporters asked me the other day, well, what about all of the partisanship? I was like, partisanship is great. You know what the alternative of partisanship is? A one-party state. Then there's no partisanship. That's where they're headed in Russia under Putin. No partisanship because there's one party. So partisanship is an expression of help and obviously we can act as grown-ups, right? If we can, model to the kids the right way to behave. But it's a good thing to be able to disagree. We'll be able to solve some of these things. And sometimes we'll be right and we'll win. Sometimes we'll be wrong and we'll lose, but we'll get through it as Americans. All right. I'll leave you with the words of the great Tom Paine, who our son Tommy was named after. And Paine said this, meaning he wrote this pamphlet, The Crisis, when things weren't going so well during the Revolutionary War, and everybody's walking around and everybody's anxious and saying we're so divided, and half the people want democracy and half the people still want the kings and the lords and all of that stuff. And so Paine wanted to write a pamphlet that would bring everybody together, and he wrote this pamphlet called The Crisis. And in it, I'm going to quote you just this passage, and I'm going to update the language a little bit so it doesn't offend modern sensibilities. Speaker close, let me do that. And he said he was a feminist and he wouldn't care, but he said, these are the times that try men and women's souls. These are the times that try men and women's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink at this moment in the service of their cause and their country. But everyone that stands with us now will win the love and the favor and the affection of every man and every woman for all time. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but we have this saving consolation. The more difficult the struggle, the more glorious in the end will be our victory. So let's make that victory ours. Thank you.